We're taught that civilization began around 5 to 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Cities, writing, and organized religion. But what if I told you that the real story might be far older than we first thought?
In the hills of southern Turkey, there's a cluster of ancient sites built roughly 11,000 years ago.
That's roughly 7,000 years before Stonehenge.
They were built right after the last ice age, and then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, they were deliberately buried. Like a message, sealed in stone for the future. This region in southeastern Turkey, near the Syrian border, is known today as Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills. Beneath these low, unassuming mounds lie dozens of ancient sites. Together, they date to a time when humans were never supposed to be capable of building anything of this scale, let alone megalithic like this. What these places represent, a ritual tradition, a forgotten civilization, or something else entirely, is still being uncovered.
But one thing's already clear. The story of our past, and perhaps even civilization itself, is not only far more complex, but perhaps even far older than we thought. For more than a century, the story of civilization has followed a familiar path.
Around 5 to 6,000 years ago, in Mesopotamia, cities form. Writing emerges, organized religion takes shape.
This is where civilization is said to begin. Before this moment, humanity is usually described very differently.
For tens of thousands of years, we're told humans lived as small groups of hunter-gatherers, mobile, adaptable, but fundamentally simple, capable of survival, but not large-scale planning, capable of symbolism, but not monumental architecture. Under this model, stone monuments come later. Stonehenge, Malta's temples, the monuments of Egypt, all built by agricultural societies, supported by surplus, hierarchy, and long-established traditions.
The assumption has long been clear.
Organized belief follows settlement. Large-scale rituals follow farming. Monuments follow villages.
But what if that order is wrong? What if belief came first? To answer that question, we have to look beyond the first cities and much farther back in time.
For most of the 20th century, the hills of southeastern Turkey didn't attract much attention. One of them was known locally as Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill. In the 1960s, the site was briefly surveyed and largely dismissed. The stones visible on the surface were assumed to be the remains of a much later occupation. Nothing remarkable.
No one suspected what lay beneath.
That changed in the 1990s, however, when Klaus Schmidt, an archaeologist from the German Archaeological Institute, returned and began to dig more seriously. As the soil was removed, something unexpected emerged. Massive stone pillars, carved into the bedrock, shaped with precision and arranged in large, circular enclosures. They were monumental, megalithic structures.
Radiocarbon dating soon delivered a shock.
Göbekli Tepe wasn't an Iron Age or even a Bronze Age site. It was far older. The oldest structures dated to around 9,600 BC, nearly 12,000 years ago, right at the end of the last ice age and the end of the Younger Dryas. Thousands of years before Stonehenge and other monumental megalithic sites, and long before the first cities or written records.
Under the traditional model, a site like this simply shouldn't exist.
The people living at this time were supposed to be small bands of hunter-gatherers, mobile, practical, but incapable of organizing large-scale construction projects. And yet, here it was. At first, Göbekli Tepe was described as the world's first temple.
That interpretation has evolved over time, and one thing was already clear.
This site didn't just pull the timeline of civilization back, it called into question the entire order of events.
Perhaps it wasn't agriculture that led to cities and civilization, but belief and ritual instead.
And Göbekli Tepe would soon prove not to be alone.
As archaeologists widened their search, similar sites began to appear in the surrounding hillsides.
Together, they began to show something far larger than a single monument, a regional tradition, a forgotten chapter in the human story.
To better understand what these people were building and why, we need to have a look inside the enclosures themselves.
As you head down the long walkway to Göbekli Tepe, the first thing you're struck by is the sheer breadth of the site and size of the enclosures.
It's a profound and humbling experience to look at something so old, built at this scale.
At the heart of the site are large circular structures carved directly into the bedrock. Each enclosure is defined by massive T-shaped stone pillars, some standing nearly 20 feet tall, 10 tons, and slotted right into the bedrock.
The craftsmanship is unmistakable.
Covering many of the pillars are beautiful relief carvings, some of the earliest known large-scale stone reliefs in human history. They depict animals, but not the animals people relied most on for food. Instead, we see predators and dangerous creatures as well. Serpents, foxes, wild boar, scorpions, vultures. These are animals associated with threat, death, and transformation. One pillar in particular has drawn intense attention, Pillar 43, often called the Vulture Stone. Here, multiple symbols are compressed into a single composition. No one knows exactly what this scene represents. Some, like Dr. Martin Sweatman, suggest it records a memory to a certain point in time based on the celestial alignments.
Although we can't decode the pillar and its images with certainty, it does show that the people who built this place were thinking symbolically at a level far deeper than survival alone.
There's few signs of everyday domestic life in the layout. Instead, the architecture draws attention inward, towards the center, towards the pillars. Even the walls tell a story. In some enclosures, later stonework partially obscures earlier carvings on the pillars.
This raises a question. How were these structures modified over time?
Did their meaning and significance change? Or was this part of the ritual itself?
We don't yet have answers to these questions.
And that uncertainty matters, as there's still only roughly 5% of the site that's been excavated. What else may lie hidden in the still buried enclosures? With the olive groves now gone, however, there are new GPR studies underway, and I'm excited to see what these studies show, and with further digging, what other secrets it will tell us about our past.
To understand how and why they gathered here, we need to look beyond the stone itself, to the people who came to these enclosures. Because Göbekli Tepe wasn't just constructed, it was returned to and built upon over generations.
One of the most striking things about Göbekli Tepe is that it doesn't behave like a single finished monument. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were not all constructed at once. Archaeological evidence suggests they were built sequentially, one after another, over an extended period of time. Some were erected, some were modified, and some were deliberately buried, perhaps while others were even still in use. This wasn't a single project carried out by a single generation. It was a place people kept coming back to.
Even some of the most seemingly basic aspects of the enclosures still remains debated,
including whether they were ever roofed at all. There's no clear evidence for permanent roofing. Some researchers imagine these spaces open to the sky. Others suggest light, temporary coverings, perhaps seasonal.
We don't yet know which is correct. What we do know is that many of the enclosures are oriented differently and not aligned at random.
Some researchers have suggested these changing orientations may reflect long-term observation of the sky, in particular of the star Sirius, a star that would have gradually reappeared above the horizon at this latitude after thousands of years of invisibility due to the Earth's precession.
If that interpretation is correct, each enclosure may have marked a slightly different moment in time. This theory is still debated, but the broader idea still stands. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not indifferent to the heavens.
If Göbekli Tepe was built over generations, then what kind of society was capable of sustaining it?
One thing about Göbekli Tepe does seem to be clear, that it wasn't shaped by ordinary daily life.
The architecture here doesn't follow the rhythms of a village. There's no streets, no clusters of houses. At the same time, Göbekli Tepe was not an empty place. Archaeologists have found stone tools, grinding stones, food remains. These are traces of human activity, but not the kind that points to permanent occupation. Göbekli Tepe appears to have been a place people traveled to, a destination. Groups may have arrived seasonally or periodically, bringing tools, food, and labor with them. They gathered here, they worked here, and then they seem to have left.
This challenges another long-held assumption, that large-scale construction requires more permanent settlement.
Instead, the Taş Tepeler sites point to communities capable of coordinating labor without cities and without agriculture as the organizing force.
What motivated people to gather here at all?
Whatever the answer, the builders of Göbekli Tepe were responding to something profound.
To understand that motivation, we need to look beyond the settlement and towards belief. Archaeologists studying Göbekli Tepe have long noted something unusual.
The scale of the architecture far exceeds what small, loosely connected groups would normally build. This wasn't casual labor. It required coordination, planning, and shared purpose.
Whatever motivated these gatherings seems to have been powerful enough to unite people beyond just kinship and survival. One clue lies in what's been found at the site.
Large quantities of animal bones, stone basins carved directly into the bedrock. Some of these basins are large enough to hold hundreds of liters, and residue analysis suggests they may have been used for fermentation.
In other words, feasting. This idea that ritual feasting played a role in early society is not unique to Göbekli Tepe.
Some of the earliest ritual sites in the region are also places of deliberate ceremonial consumption. At nearby Natufian sites, such as Raqefet Cave in modern-day Israel, which goes back nearly 13,000 years, archaeologists have identified some of the earliest known evidence for brewing as well. These traces predate full-scale agriculture,
Which raises a provocative possibility.
that it wasn't bread, but beer that helped bring people together.
That ritual gatherings, and not farming, may have been the initial catalyst for social complexity.
In The Immortality Key, Brian Mirarescu has suggested that early ritual drinks may have carried deeper ceremonial significance, not simply nourishment, but shared experiences tied to belief, memory, ideas of the afterlife, and possibly even altered states.
This interpretation remains debated, but offers a compelling framework. Seen through this lens, the imagery at Göbekli Tepe takes on new weight.
The animals carved into the pillars are not passive, they're powerful, dangerous, transformative. In many later cultures, similar imagery appears at the boundary between life and death. It's possible these enclosures were not just gathering places, but stages for ritual and possibly spiritual experiences.
If this interpretation is even partially correct, it forces a reversal of the usual interpretation.
Instead of agriculture giving rise to organized belief, belief may have helped give rise to agriculture. Large ritual gatherings require food, and if fermented drinks were involved, sustained plant resources may have pushed communities towards cultivation. That raises a deeper question around organization. Dr. Irving Finkel of the British Museum notes that writing in Mesopotamia likely emerged in part to manage labor, goods, and resources at scale. He points to a small green stone object from Göbekli Tepe he interprets as a possible seal, suggesting systems of coordination may have already existed here. Whether or not it represents true writing, it suggests the builders were organizing themselves at a scale we still don't fully understand.
But belief alone doesn't explain everything, because these spaces weren't just used, they were deliberately closed. At some point, the major enclosures were intentionally filled in.
This doesn't appear to have been a result of neglect or simple abandonment. The evidence suggests it was done deliberately. The pillars themselves were not toppled or smashed. They were buried standing upright.
Archaeology can tell us how these spaces were buried, but not with certainty why.
The burial of Göbekli Tepe may reflect a kind of closure rather than an act of erasure. The enclosure doesn't all appear to have been buried at the same moment either. Some were filled while others were still in use. As new enclosures were constructed, sometimes with different orientations, older ones may have been retired, a rhythm of building, use, and closure.
Even allowing for ritual closure, the sheer scale of this act remains difficult to explain. Filling these spaces required enormous effort.
Labor carefully expended, with no obvious practical return. Whatever the motivation, the act itself seemed to carry meaning. Ironically, it was this burial that preserved Göbekli Tepe, protecting the pillars and carvings for nearly 10 millennia.
Effectively, an archaeological time capsule that preserved the site in remarkable condition.
Other places within Taş Tepeler show signs of intentional closure as well, different expressions of a shared practice. And that leads to even more questions.
Who were these people? How expansive was their culture? Why were these sites buried on purpose? And what were they trying to preserve?
Göbekli Tepe often dominates the conversation, but it's only one piece of a much larger picture. Less than 40 kilometers away lies another site, quieter, less famous, but no less extraordinary. Karahan Tepe.
I was fortunate enough to visit the site of Karahan Tepe in the spring of 2023.
At the time, it was still in the earlier stages of excavation.
It felt raw, organic, and incredibly special.
There were no walkways, no barriers. You just walked straight up into the hills.
And almost immediately, you could feel that this place was special.
As you approach the excavations, the scale starts to reveal itself. large enclosures, striking in their size, cut directly into the landscape. But even that was just the beginning. As you walk across the site, you'll find flint everywhere, scattered across the ground.
And then you notice something else.
T-pillars, not fully exposed, just the tops of them, eroded, protruding through the soil, like stone chutes breaking through the surface.
It dawns on you slowly. This isn't a single structure. It's an entire complex, and most of it remains buried.
At the heart of Karahan Tepe lies the main excavation area. Here are massive T-pillars lying within carved spaces that echo Göbekli Tepe, but feel fundamentally different. The scale is still monumental, but the space feels much more open. One of the most striking features is a carved serpent's head protruding from the bedrock. It's ominous, and one of the most enigmatic and recognizable images from the site. This appears in a separate chamber, alongside pillars carved with phallic forms. It's connected to a channel cut into the rock, a kind of conduit.
Whether it carried water, blood, or something symbolic, we don't yet know.
Researchers such as Hugh Newman and J.J. Ainsworth have noted that on the winter solstice sunrise, sunlight strikes the serpent's head.
It's a stark reminder that these builders were tracking cycles, time, and had a sophisticated knowledge of the heavens. Since my visit at Karahan Tepe, excavations have accelerated.
New rooms have been uncovered, including square chambers, which may have been domestic spaces or shrines. New sculptures have emerged, a striking vulture figure, and a tall, male statue with an exaggerated phallus.
These discoveries are recent, and they're still reshaping how archaeologists understand the site.
Not everything here was completed either. Some chambers near the sunken pit appear to have been left unfinished, and on the hillside, there's a T-pillar still embedded in its quarry, never fully extracted, a moment frozen in time.
Walking across Karahan Tepe, there's a feeling that's hard to describe.
A sense of scale, of age, a connection to our ancestors. Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe start to tell a wider story. The Taş Tepeler culture wasn't an isolated single experiment. It was a broader network with shared beliefs, practices, and traditions. Today, more than a dozen sites are associated with what's now called Taş Tepeler.
And that number continues to grow. What's clear is that this region at this time was active on a scale that no one anticipated. Whether we call this a civilization is still debated, but certain elements are hard to ignore.
Shared architectural language, shared symbols, shared practices, long-term planning, and activity spanning centuries. This is broad organization, even if it doesn't fit later definitions.
And importantly, most of the Taş Tepeler sites remain buried underground, and the discovery is happening now, in real time, and at a remarkable pace. And they remind us of something important. This story isn't finished. It's still being written. Every new excavation and discovery has the potential to reshape our story, and it already has.
Across Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and the wider Taş Tepeler landscape, we see the same ideas repeated. Serpents, human figures, hands carved around stone bodies, animals associated with danger, death, and transformation.
What makes this imagery and symbolism remarkable isn't just that it appears here. Some of these same motifs appear much later in different places and in different cultures.
The serpent motif is one of the most enduring images connected to these sites. Across the Mediterranean and Near East, it appears around coiled staffs, a symbol of healing, renewal, and knowledge, the staff of Asclepius. In Mesoamerica, the serpent rises again in monumental form, feathered, cosmic, and civilizing, Quetzalcoatl. These cultures are separated by vast distances, both in time and geography.
This doesn't require direct inheritance, but it does raise a quiet possibility.
That some symbols speak to deeper, shared human concerns, life, death, and transformation.
Other symbols are harder to place.
At Göbekli Tepe on Pillar 43 are rectangular shapes with curved handles, often described as handbags. Thousands of years later, similar motifs appear again in Assyrian reliefs from the same broader region, examples you can still see in the British Museum today. In Malta, monumental stone temples emerge with curving architecture, rounded chambers, and powerful feminine figures associated with fertility, death, and regeneration. The architecture is different, but the underlying themes feel familiar. Research by Lenny Ridgett has also suggested that some Maltese temples align with the rising of the star Sirius, a possibility that, if confirmed, could push the aspects of their origin back towards the time of the Taş Tepeler culture itself.
And then there is the ritual itself.
At Taş Tepeler and earlier Natufian sites, we see evidence of fermentation and communal consumption, rather than daily subsistence. Later traditions in the region developed complex ritual drinks, like the Minoans, and then the ancient Greeks with the Koukion, which became central to the Eleusinian mysteries. Brian Mirarescu has suggested these traditions may represent a long arc of ritual experience, reinterpreted across generations.
This remains debated, but the continuity of ritualized, shared experience is striking.
After the end of the last ice age, populations moved out of Anatolia and across the Mediterranean into Europe, carrying tools, practices, and ideas with them.
Taş Tepeler may not be the origin of all later traditions, but it may represent something foundational, a deep reservoir of symbolic thought.
Perhaps some of these ideas were carried forward from much older traditions, even cultures that lived during the last ice age. If these symbols endured, reappearing across distant places and times, then Taş Tepeler is not just an archaeological curiosity.
It's part of a much larger human conversation, one that stretches across millennia. But symbols alone don't explain everything.
They don't explain how places like this appeared so suddenly,
at a time when nothing like this was supposed to even exist. And they don't explain who these people really were,
or why they were able to organize themselves at this scale, far earlier in human history than we thought. And we've barely touched the surface of what still lies buried at these sites.
The Taş Tepeler sites don't nearly give us all the clear answers we want, however. But it forces us to recognize that there is far more to our past than we once believed. And we need to keep searching, re-examining, and questioning what we thought we once knew. It's an invitation to ask more about our ancestors and what their story tells us about ourselves and what it means to be human. And we're living in the moment when it's being uncovered, a new age of discovery.